to further discuss this, I was joined by Louise Murphy, Senior Economist at the Resolution Foundation, and Deven Ghelani, founder of Policy and Practice and an expert on welfare policy. I began by asking Louise if she feels there is scope for cuts to the welfare budget.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely understandable that ministers are looking at the welfare budget, particularly in light of increased defence spending and all of the recent developments this past few weeks. And I think one reason why the welfare bill has caught people's attention is that particularly spending on health-related benefits has increased quite sharply over the past few years. It's right that ministers are looking at this part of the welfare budget and thinking about ways that it can be improved. I think the trickier thing is deciding what should change and how that will work.
Deven, you were involved in setting up the universal credit system. Obviously, that was a big change to the welfare system. Do you think that now this moment has come where the Chancellor's looking at the welfare department? Should it also be thinking in bigger terms about wider reform?
I think wider reform is the only way to make a proper change to the system. I think what the risk is, and there's a slight sense of deja vu here, having tried to push through what I think was a sensible long-term reform with universal credit alongside a backdrop of austerity and a whole range of other cuts to social security that were introduced in 2013, where I think the department was stuck with trying to find the least bad way to make savings, short-term savings that were being demanded of them by the Chancellor. And I think long-term reform, substantial structural reform, takes time. And when that's put against the backdrop of wanting short-term savings to hit what, on one level, are somewhat arbitrary fiscal rules, that's when you start to get, pretty suboptimal policy that does real damage to people. And in some respects, I'd say the increase in inactivity and sickness that we're facing it's certainly been impacted by austerity over the last decade. So in some sense, we're sort of reaping what we sowed, and actually sensible structural reform is probably what I would like to see.
Well, I seem to recall that when Ian Duncan-Smith was trying to get universal credit set up, he asked for a big upfront payment from George Osborne, didn't he? Because he was arguing then that unless you put the money in at the start, you're never going to have a system that works to its optimum capacity. Do you think that we're in a similar situation now?
I think it just takes time to deliver those savings. So it's a short-term investment worth the long-term benefit. And I think in the universal credit case, from my perspective, it clearly was. It suffered a lot from being introduced in the backdrop of austerity, but it kind of showed what value it could bring during the pandemic. You saw how much of a better system it was when you had a lot of people that suddenly needed to rely upon it.
Yes, and as we were saying, it's a perennial issue. How many ministers have we heard saying, let's cut the welfare budget? Louise Murphy, from the Resolution Foundation's point of view, I mean, you obviously, you look at the figures, don't you? We know that an increasing share of welfare goes on health-related benefits, and the costs are expected to reach 100 billion by the end of the decade. We know that there are 1 million young people out of work, education or training, 3 million off sick, not being able to work. And we were talking there about incentives. It's really little to incentivise them to go to work. So can I just ask you to outline a few options that you think could pop up for the Chancellor as she looks at how to make these cuts and how to bring some more money into the Treasury? What do you see as the options? Can you give us a few?
Yes, so I think the first thing to note is that we hear a lot about people being out of work and work incentives, but actually we should remember that the biggest driver of increasing health-related benefit spend over the rest of the decade is actually in disability benefits. So largely that's personal independence payment, PIP, which is not an out-of-work benefit. It's really designed to cover the additional costs of disability. And I think we should just bear that in mind when thinking about the types of people that will be receiving that benefit. When we think then about the options that are on the table to make savings, there's really, I think, 3 ways that you can impact the spend. The first, which is something that we hear quite a lot about, is restricting eligibility. So that's changing the assessments to say that in the future, certain groups will find it harder to qualify for these benefits. But I think why that's difficult is that the savings do take longer to add up, because that's just gradually affecting new people as they flow onto the system. And so if what we've heard about today is a desire to make big savings in the short term, then changing the assessments might not be enough. So instead, what is a sort of guaranteed way to make savings more quickly would be to change entitlements. So saying for existing claimants, we will pay them a bit less each month, or we'll create different levels of payment so that some people receive less benefit income.
But that would hit a lot of people already on low incomes, wouldn't it? That sorry to interrupt, but that would hit a lot of people already on low incomes, and it would hit their living standards, wouldn't it? So, I guess for a lot of people that would be a step too far, wouldn't it, to make a pay cut? What about limiting the amount of time that somebody could be on benefits? Would that be an option to be considered?
Exactly. I think that is really what we see as a crucial kind of third, often forgotten part of the story, which is thinking about durations on benefits, where that is a way to reduce spend. If we say that people will spend a shorter time receiving health-related benefits, that often is difficult, and history teaches us that often people do remain on these benefits for a long time. But I think what we would say is that we should be doing more, both just for financial reasons, but also we morally should be doing more to support people. Currently, the exit rates from these benefits are very, very low, and so we should be doing more for people who are out of work to encourage them, if it is at all possible, to look for employment. And also, more generally, what we should be doing is investing in the day-to-day functioning of the benefit system. As we've chatted about, the legacy of austerity over the past decade or so is that the investment in things like people doing reassessments, the day-to-day functioning of job centres has really been stretched. And one impact of that is that we just aren't doing very many benefit reassessments, and so people are remaining on these health-related benefits for longer durations than in the past.
Yes, and often mental health issues are cited as a reason to be on benefits as well. Deven, you know that there's always that argument about there are people taking this money from the government, they don't really need it, they're not really ill. I hate to use the word scroungers, but, for a lot of people, that's what's happening. Is there a way of sorting out the people that are genuinely needing this help? And would there be enough there in terms of money freed up to satisfy the Treasury, do you think?
That is often a perception, not one that I particularly sort of align with. But I would just like to say, I think a couple of things you could do just to slow the flow of people onto disability benefits, which is one way you can reduce the numbers, because these numbers are projected to rise. So kind of stopping the increases is one thing you could do. I like the idea of introducing statutory sick pay, which I think is like a decent level of statutory sick pay for a period of time, which the employer is responsible for. So they have an incentive to encourage that person to get back into, either find another role that's suitable for them or get back into work as quickly as possible. So if that lasted for, say, 6 months or a year, that creates a little window before they move on to long-term benefits and stops the system from being quite so binary, where you're well enough to work or too sick to work, and actually there's nothing in between. It sort of creates that sort of buffer, which is where you can kind of monitor the impact and effectiveness of interventions and actually judge kind of people's responses to getting back into work, and maybe make the kinds of judgments you're talking about. Actually, have you got an illness that is short-term where you could be helped back into work, or is it genuinely long-term that is? And in those cases, I think it's perfectly reasonable to award people disability benefits for the long term and not reassess them. But yes, you're right. You need to be sure. And currently, we've got a system where you're kind of saying people's perception of these of people on disability benefits, how many of them actually need it. That's a perception that's come about because the system isn't working very well.
And Louise, obviously for Labour MPs, if they're hearing their Chancellor talking about cuts like this, it's a very, very difficult thing for them, because most of them are passionately committed to generous welfare state provision, many concerned about making these entitlements less generous, and lots of them, of course, have campaigned against Tory welfare cuts. How difficult a decision will this be then for the Labour Party? And do you think that in the end the welfare budget will be cut, or might Rachel Reeves' eyes rest elsewhere? What do you think?
I think you're right that it is certainly a difficult area, difficult decisions to be made. I mean, I think many people across the political spectrum would agree that the welfare system could work better. I think lots of second disabled people themselves would say currently the system is unpleasant. The trust in the system is very low. So I don't think we should say that we should just accept the status quo and do nothing. But I think also many people would say, big kind of rush through cuts are not the right way ahead. And of course, the Labour government does have decisions. It can choose where to make changes to its tax and spending. Of course, the Chancellor might feel like she needs to stick to this fiscal rules that she's set, and that's right and proper, but there are other ways that she could do that through changes to taxes or to other parts of public spending. It is not inevitable that we need to make many billions of cuts to the welfare in the next 5 years. That is a choice rather than an inevitability.
OK. And Deven, just finally to you then, how politically damaging do you think this could be? Because we know that Keir Starmer's faced criticism, hasn't he, for changing the winter fuel allowance entitlement. There will be many people who'll be worried about going even further to take entitlement from people who they think deserve it. Do you think it'll be damaging politically?
I mean, if you think of yes, in short, I mean, I guess the point I would make is, we've got a government that was elected on the basis of making sensible long-term changes that many people felt needed to be made. It was the investment in housing. It was the investment in skills. It's the investment in kind of people's opportunity. And I think, again, the trade-off that I think the government might feel it's faced with, but I think it's a false choice. I don't think you need to stick to what are kind of, I think the fiscal rules can be bent further to allow for long-term investment, to do the right thing and invest in people, invest in kind of places, invest in kind of what we need, because that's what delivers the best outcome for the long term. I think if it feels like kind of almost a George Osborne-esque budget that we saw in 2013, it's very hard to know what people are actually going to be voting for with this government. I appreciate we've got difficult choices, but I think making the right sensible long-term investment decisions is probably the one thing this government has kind of sensibly called for, and I think would be welcomed by all sides. Whereas I think short-term cuts will be attacked. You're seeing it with every single one of the Chancellor's decisions where they're trying to take money out of the system. They're being kind of, that is going to live long in the memory, I think.
That was Deven Ghelani, founder of Policy and Practice and an expert on welfare policy, in discussion with Louise Murphy, a senior economist at the Resolution Foundation. The time now is 11:54. You're listening to Carolyn Quinn in for Carole Walker on Times Radio.